coming at you all the way live from the lower bottoms of West Oakland. This is Revolution. 2020 is done. 2020 is finished. It is in the rear view mirror of life. Does that now mean that we can look forward to going back to whatever was normal in 2021? Because now we have a vaccine. How well will the vaccine work? We don't know. Who's going to get it? We don't really know. Will anything really change from 2020? We don't know. But what we do know is I ended the year with the live stream that we do with 3 of my friends. It was a fun show. Cedric Johnson, Touré Reed, and of course my live stream co-host Pascal Robert. We had a good show. We had a good talk. As usual, we had a litany of questions, and we got a little off track about where we wanted to go with the questions. We didn't want to make it a total year-end wrap-up show where we go over certain big stories and kind of revisit them, because ultimately 2020 and 2021 is pretty much swallowed up by 2 big things. This is just my opinion. COVID and Trump. The ending of Trump. But in some people's minds, kind of an opportunity, this was also an opportunity to analyze one of the big questions is how, after mishandling a pandemic so badly and really doubling down on his racist rhetoric, how did Trump garner so many more black votes? So that was definitely a question that we asked, and Touré and Cedric riffed on that. And I really wanted to delve more into COVID, but unfortunately we didn't get a chance to. We will be talking with these fellas again, most likely in live stream format. So if you haven't done it already, you got to go do it. There is a link in the description of the show, wherever you're watching the show. It's youtube.com/This Is Revolution Podcast. Go subscribe to the YouTube channel, and every Tuesday at 6 p.m., Pascal and I do a live stream where we have a guest. And coming up Tuesday, January 5th, we're talking to Hannah Appel of the Debt Collective, and please go get the book. I had Hannah Appel on the podcast a while back. I think she's episode 72, if I'm not mistaken. Great show. Didn't have a lot of time, but in that 58 minutes I think she gave me, we hammered out a lot, and I'm really looking forward to the live stream. Also, we're changing things up as far as like the time of the live stream. Some of these things go on for like 2.5 hours, and my original plan for this particular episode was to talk for an hour and a half and then go to Patreon. But in the giving nature of this show, we just did the whole thing, and it definitely got a little looser and more fun towards the end. And I want to do a show where we revisit the movie RoboCop. I recently watched a few horrible movies. So I grew up as a kid that was babysat by I shouldn't say babysat, because I was kind of like a young, maybe a tween. But my mother, who I lived with, worked nights, and I watched a lot of Cinemax. So you can, and I'm in my 40s, so I definitely was a child of the late 80s, early 90s. And a lot of Canon films came on. And I watched the Ninja 3, The Domination, probably like 100 times. And Delta Force 1 through 47. Every single American Ninja. Canon films made some horribly wonderful films. And I don't think they did RoboCop, actually. But anyway, as I'm watching RoboCop, there's a scene where it starts off the corporation that's I can't even call them the evil corporation, because ultimately they're the corporation that creates the hero, right? RoboCop is the hero. Also, RoboCop was a freaking cartoon in the late 80s, early 90s too. So the corporation is they make this as they're doing their presentation, right, to bring out this police officer that doesn't need to eat or sleep, and that's the whole thing. They're like, the police force in New Detroit or Old Detroit, I forget what they, because it's the future, right? It takes place in the year 2028. The police department is ran by a private corporation, and this private corporation is creating robotic police officers, and in trying to show the board how these new police officers are going to work, they give a gun to a low-level employee. The robot can see the gun and tells the guy to drop it. The guy drops the gun, but there's a flaw in the robot, and he puts 100 rounds into this man. It's a pretty bloody scene. And again, if you go to YouTube, I actually played this clip towards the end of the show, because when I'm with Touré and Pascal and Cedric, I definitely like to play certain movies for those guys to riff on, because we sit around and talk about stuff like this on our free time. And after this happens, then this other gentleman who put the whole cyborg thing together for RoboCop goes, hey, well, I have a better idea. We'll use a not quite robotic robot that doesn't need to eat or sleep to rid the city of crime. And one of the things that the corporation is trying to do is they're trying to rid the city of crime so they can build a new city and bring in 2 million jobs. It's actually in the movie, the CEO says, we need to rid the city of crime so we can bring in these 2 million jobs. I think he even says good jobs. And that to me is like neoliberal capitalism in a nutshell. So at some point I want to definitely do a show where we revisit RoboCop and really break it down, and we'll probably play clips and stuff like that. That was a lot of fun. So Tuesday we do the live stream with the guest. The first guest of the new year is Hannah Appel from the Debt Collective. They have a book out right now called Can't Pay, Won't Pay. Great book about debtors' unions. So you know how you have a union for your job that gives you strength in numbers? Imagine a union of debtors that also would give you strength in numbers. To put us in a position that we can eliminate certain unjust debts. Payday loans. Ridiculous student loans. And they've done a lot of work since, I want to say 2012, with their debtors unions. So definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can watch that episode, because I don't know if I'm going to be putting all these episodes for podcast purposes. I'm getting back to scheduling interviews and talking to people, and I have some really interesting interviews lined up already that I'm pretty stoked for. And Thursday, we're going to be doing a live stream. Just Pascal and myself will be going more over events of the week. And I don't know if I'm going to add one more live stream day in there. But definitely we're going to be doing Tuesday night and Thursday night, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Tuesday we'll always have a guest. and Thursday will be a little bit shorter, going over the events of the week. We've already planned out the Thursday coming show. We're going to kind of look at the failures of the CARES package, and we're also going to look at the incoming Congress and Senate people and the runoff, which is going to go down Wednesday in Georgia, and how that will affect the Senate. With a very important runoff going on, you would think Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell would do his damnedest to make sure that his Republican Senate running mates were going to be shown in a good light, but to deny $2,000 checks for people, it's kind of like, I don't really give a shit. So it's going to be an interesting conversation. So here is the year-end episode. It starts off with a clip I made of Cedric Robinson on my show earlier in the summer, where he's talking about Black Lives Matter, because I definitely this summer I looked at a lot of the events that were happening with protests and everything. And where I live in Oakland, of course, is going to be a hot spot, right, of this kind of activity, and defund the police. And my fear was always, these things are so slogan-based that they're easy to get co-opted. And I asked Cedric about movements like defund the police and BLM and the ease of co-optation for these movements, and he gave a beautiful answer. And this is only a 6-minute clip of his response. And sometimes when I make these clips, it's hard to cut them because we elaborate. And ultimately, they're commercials for you guys to go back and listen to the full show. So definitely, I believe Cedric Robinson was show number 49. So please go back and listen to that. Thank you guys again for listening to this show and helping it grow. I can't believe that we did as many episodes as we did last year. At the end of 2019, my band Bitter Lake was looking forward to a very promising 2020. We had just come off of a very successful tour with a larger act called Divide and Dissolve, where we got to do North America with them, US and Canada. And we were looking to do another run, not with him, but with another larger band. And then COVID hit and everything got canceled, and I got to dive headfirst into this show. And thank you guys so much for paying attention to it, sharing it, conversating with me, especially on the live streams. I love it. It's as close as I can get to playing live is the live stream. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you guys. Enjoy the show. If you'd like to help the show grow, there's a link to the patreon.com/BitterLakePresents. We're going to be changing up some of the things that are things you get when you sign up for the show, because it's a little more Bitter Lake centered. And now with the show kind of getting as big as it's gotten, there are people that just don't listen to punky metal. So maybe they don't want a shirt from a punky metal band and stuff like that. So we'll be getting show merchandise. We'll be getting some other things in there, but also we're going to be creating a lot more content for the Patreon. So that being said, I'm going to shut up now. Here is the end of the year show with Touré Reed, Cedric Johnson, my co-host Pascal Robert. I would say the first hour or so is a more serious talk, and the last 45 minutes to an hour is definitely pretty fun. It's pretty fun. So thank you guys, and I look forward to a better 2021.
aspects of black power are very disturbing to us because it means revolution. It means violence. But other aspects of black power are very constructive because it means that black people, they want to stand on their own feet. They want to have black banks and not just go to white banks. They want to have black businesses and not just go to the white businesses. And they should have, and they will have.
One of the things that you hit on that is like my big fear with all the protests, the uprisings that we're seeing across the country, and the toppling of Confederate monuments, the painting Black Lives Matter on city streets. My fear is that this movement that we're in the middle of could possibly get co-opted. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm of two minds about it, right? There's the reality that some of it has already been co-opted, and it was so easily co-opted because it wasn't necessarily incompatible with corporate ways of thinking and talking about diversity, right? There's certain ways of thinking about the market and how everyone should have access to it that wasn't incompatible with what I think the most mainstream notion of Black Lives Matter is, which is it's a demand for equal protection before the law, right? It's a demand for full recognition of African Americans as citizens, within the context of liberal democracy, right? And that's not incompatible if you work at Microsoft or Google, right? Even if they're not going to engage in aggressive hiring, right? That as far as marketing, public relations, that's something that they can assimilate, right? And so I think there's that part of it, right, where as I mentioned in one of the pieces that came out, last month, there's ideological convergence, maybe more so than cooptation, which happened, right? Where you've got particular expressions of Black Lives Matter, which again fit nicely within the context of the corporate world, right? So another good example of this, right? I mean, I love Kaepernick, and I supported Kaepernick in his stance. But what happens after Kaepernick gets booted from the NFL, right? He's picked up by Nike, and I'm glad they gave him a way to survive. But what does that say, right? It's like Nike didn't have a problem with his stance on an extreme problem, right? The problem of police killing of Black civilians, right? So it's kind of like that's something that we can all oppose and should all oppose. But there are other political stances that Black people are taking and have been taking over the last few months, which aren't co-opted or embraced by the corporate world in the same ways, right? So, many Black people who are in the so-called essential workers category, right? People who continue to work in the food service industry, who are in the production of livestock and other food supplies, people who are in the delivery, right, and shipping. Dimensions, gig economy folks who are working for Instacart and all these other companies. A lot of them said, we're not being protected in the midst of this pandemic. We don't have basic safety equipment. We don't have, we're not being paid adequately. We should get more money for this. And so some of them begin organizing strikes and walkouts and circulating petitions. Those organizers got fired, right? So you can see in that case, we're still talking about black people in many cases, but their demands don't square with what the central logics of capital actually are, right? Which is those demands are they actually cut into the kind of profit making that these corporations exist for, right? So I think that's where we can see how do you stop something from being co-opted, right? You make demands which don't necessarily square as easily with the central logics of capital. That would be my sense of it. But I mean, a lot of people, when I wrote that piece, there were people who rejected it on the grounds that, well, this is always going to happen, and that there's something else that's going on here that's more substantial on the ground, and it hasn't been co-opted, right? And so, there's been a few friends of mine have made that argument to me. I've seen a few other people respond on social media with the same kind of sentiment. And I mean, that's true up to a point, right? There are things that are happening on the ground which have nothing to do with the corporate right? There's campaigns locally where people are pushing for real reforms, right? So I'm not denying that, but I just think that it does matter though, right? Because the money is gonna shape some behaviors, and it's gonna shape certain organizations going forward, whether we like to think about that or not, right? I mean, it is going to set the agenda as far as what Black Lives Matter might mean, or any racism is going to mean in concrete terms, both within the corporate world, but also within, civil rights organizations, anti-policing organizations, and campaigns locally. But I think that's a real fear about being co-opted. I just think that some things that are more difficult to be co-opted, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of why, and to keep pushing for those things, right? Things that the front office and the corporate world really does not want. Those should be our demands.
To hear the
All right. Thanks very much. This is the end of the year show, and a lot has happened since this whole thing started, and I'm pretty excited for this show because one of the guests on this show kind of sorta is the reason this whole end of the year show is even happening. Cedric Johnson was nice enough to give me an interview, probably 3-4 months ago. And through that interview, I was able to get Touré Reed. And from Touré, he introduced me to the new show co-host, Pascal Robert. So Cedric, I would like to say first and foremost, thank you very much for making this whole thing happen. So today, we're not going to go through a event by event thing that happened in the year. There was a couple big events that really cloud this year for us, right? That's the election and coronavirus and the handling of coronavirus. So without any further ado, let me introduce my co-host, my dog, Pascal Robert. How you living?
We're all right, brother. Good evening to you. Good to hear from you tonight. Some people were confused about whether or not the live feed was on. I don't know if it was actually coming on Facebook or YouTube. But part of the reasons why you weren't seeing us is that we usually, in the beginning of the show, do an intro where we have a few minutes of a guest's prior engagement with Jason in a prior interviewing session with some clips of different images and so on and so forth. So if you see maybe 5, 7, 8 minute period and you don't see us talking, it's because we're kind of just setting up the tone of the show with the intro segment. So, we will, all of these things the kinks will be worked out as we move on for more professionalization of how we present
seamlessly
this program. But I'm very excited for tonight's show because not only have I grown to know and like Jason personally, but also the two other guests that we're having, Cedric Johnson and Touré Reed, are brothers who I've read their work personally, and I consider them to be some of the top scholars of Black political thought. Books like Towards Freedom. Yes, Janice Graham, by the way, you knew you had Touré Reed on your show at my urging, and you were very happy with that. You got to get Cedric on your show as well.
Well, let's introduce these gentlemen. I'm going to introduce these gentlemen real quick, and then I'll let you do the beautiful particulars. Professor Cedric Johnson, author of I just have it right.
Revolutionaries to Race Leaders.
I almost said race traders.
Oh, well, some people will
That's another end.
You're like tomato.
Just to let you know, I'm keeping it real. Got the book right here. It's a must-read for Black political education. Revolutionaries to Race Leaders. Black Power in the Making of African American Politics.
And last but not least, we have coming all the way from the boondocks of Illinois, Touré Reed.
Hey, can you hear me? Do I sound
hear
like
you.
devil?
You not all devilly.
Cool.
So Cedric, real quick, was it 2 weeks ago or last week? I made that clip of that part of our discussion, right?
Right.
And people have been listening to it or whatever, watching it, whatever. And so Pascal is talking, and this dude is commenting on the chat. He's like, Cedric Robinson, man, I love you. I learned so much from the thing. I was like, nah, they all don't sound alike. I was like,
right.
Pascal is very from New York. And you
I
hear
am.
all the abrasiveness of the subway.
The two fair complexion Creole type brothers down there, more Louisiana born and bred. You know what I'm saying? But that's all right. They're cool brothers. Yeah, these are my boys. I like them very much, and we're gonna have a good show tonight because one very important point to me is that these are brothers who have dedicated much of their lives as professional, what's called in academia, African Americanists, meaning that they spent their adult lives studying Black American political history and actual history. Touré Reed is a historian, and I want to shout out one of Touré's books that I think is one of the most important pieces of historical documentation, besides his Towards Freedom book, that I think he's had. And by the way, don't think I'm going to have this tone with these Negroes the whole night, because I'm going to start calling them out. Because this guy agree with some of them doesn't mean I'm not going to put them on the spot. I will usually put them on the spot, but
Right.
now I got to give props. This book, Not Arms But Opportunity, The Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift, 1910 and 1950. You got to recirculate some speaking engagements for this book. And what's really important about having academics, black academics, who understand the importance of class in shaping black politics, and I've said this on social media before, is that one of the reasons why white leftists cannot understand black politics is because they don't take class amongst black people seriously. And that's very obvious. Gentlemen, do you agree or you disagree?
Yep, I was nodding. I don't know if you noticed.
Mine was a subtle nod. So.
I was going to hear, something else. So go ahead.
Yeah, they do not take class, and liberals understand class amongst black people as much as they can weaponize it to their political ends. So, in other words, they will let you know why it's important where Kamala Harris went to college and what sorority she went to. Liberal, Democratic, Socialists, or SOCDEMs don't even know what that means. And don't know why they need to manipulate that, or why the Democratic Party is making such a big deal about that. But gentlemen like yourselves, particularly someone like Touré, who wrote a whole exposition of one of the old line legacy civil rights movement organizations, the National Urban League, demonstrates that the history and the image that we have of these folks as good racemen, uplift the race, and doing their do-gooder duty to make black folk strive, and it's all in us together, actually masks a more complicated history of classism, elitism. And I'm glad Janice said that. Most black people are too focused on the boule and at the tenant association leaders and Section 8 housing. Let me tell you why that's a very important statement. Because today, when black people are just starting today to realize that they may have class enemies, they reduce the whole phenomenon to, it's the boule Negroes, the boule Negroes. First of all, 3/4 of the folks that you're talking about who are, you believe, selling black folk out are probably likely not in the boule or haven't known a person in the boule their whole life. Okay? They may be in a fraternity or sorority. The majority of fraternity and sorority people are not in the boule. Small percentage of them are. But that doesn't mean that there are not other social mechanisms that exist within the black community that were considered uplift movements, like the National Urban League, that don't have class consequences as toxic as many of those other organizations that we've had in the black community. And this is not me just trying to say, the National Urban League is toxic. Well, if you read in some of the behaviors documented in Touré's book, in terms of what they were doing with white landlords and agreements they had as to what kind of black folk got housing, you might be very shocked. And by the way, as someone who's a member of one of these fraternities and sororities, what was most appreciative, what I appreciated most about this book is that one of the things that my fraternity prides itself on is that every president of the National Urban League except one has been a member of my fraternity. The National Urban League is literally, you can say, an ideological outgrowth of my fraternity's project. So if this is the ideological outgrowth of the oldest black fraternity in America, it can be an indication that the Talented 10th Uplift Movement project that we still cling on may have a lot more between the weeds that very few of our scholars are interrogating, because we're taught to look at black history with this kind of vindication. It was like, look, There's Booker T. Washington. He was wonderful. Look, there's W.B. Du Bois. He was wonderful. Look, there's Malcolm X. He was wonderful. Without really interrogating how did these figures actually function in the politics of their time, and what individuals actually worked with, financed them, or intersected with them in ways that may not particularly be beneficial to the majority of working class Black folk. And why I'm very happy to have both of these brothers on is that not only Touré, but particularly Cedric, they have a history of writing about African American politics and history that it exposes these types of internal contradictions. And by the way, Black people should not be ashamed that they have class enemies. They should be proud that we are sophisticated of a people, that we function like other human beings. We're not an army of ants together moving in unison. We have various cultures, various ideologies, various class definitions amongst the cadre. So we're going to get to the 2020 questions, but I'd like the two of these gentlemen to speak a little bit about that project in their career work and why. And I've always said this: I love Black folk from Louisiana. And someone asked me, no, I'm dead serious. I said, Louisiana brothers are basically exported Haitians. They know when Black folk are screwing them over because we know that back home. They have the same internal sense, so they don't get diluted into this class. We all get together now, hoss kind of stuff. Gentlemen, I'll leave it to you if you want to riff on that before we get to the hard questions.
Sid, you want to take that first, or
you want me to lead off?
You want to hit? Who should hit lead off? Should Touré hit lead off? He actually played baseball,
right?
So do you want to
baseball too?
Yeah, for a little while.
Cedric
played as long as you did.
Well, Cedric wants to chomp at the bit. I can tell he wants to hit that one.
Ced's gonna hit lead off.
Sure, I'll go first.
Go for it, Ricky Henderson.
So I guess what I'll say about that, a common misconception, and maybe Touré has had the same experience. Whenever we make the class analysis or offer the class analysis of Black life, one response you'll get from people to try to delegitimate what you're saying is they'll assume that the reason you're making that argument is either you're coming from some sort of right-wing or conservative perspective, right? Or even worse, they'll challenge your legitimacy as a Black person and question your authenticity, right? They'll wonder whether or not you grew up around Black people and in Black institutions. And I'm always waiting for that when you're using the baseball analogy. That's like throwing it right down, down the plate for me, because that's how I came to the class analysis. It wasn't through, through books. It was through actually being in Black institutions and having grown up around Black fraternities and sororities, being a part of a Black fraternity, going to an historically Black college, growing up in a Black church, and witnessing my own town in South Louisiana be transformed from one that was governed by essentially by the old planter class in my hometown, and how it was transformed into a Black-run town. And so between the 1980s up until now, we've had, I think, 7 Black mayors in my hometown. And so even as a teenager, I was able to watch up close and personal the ways in which the forms of ethnic politics that we're hearing again echoed in the wake of George Floyd's murder were insufficient, right? That they were limited, that you could actually see the problems of that even back in the 1980s when I was a teenager, and even earlier, in other cities. So I think for me, I came to the analysis first on my own and in my own way as a teenager, as somebody who was in Black institutions, immersed within the Black world of South Louisiana and the world that gripped the Interstate 10 corridor from Houston all the way across to Mobile, basically, is where my family was. And then as an academic, I remember making some arguments to my grad advisor, Linda Faye Williams, who was a native of Texas. She actually died in the early 2000s, I was making some arguments about Black people and class contradictions. And she reached on her shelf and grabbed the Jesse Jackson phenomenon and told me that I really needed to read more of Adolph Reed's work. And so I think, like for me, again, it comes from the experience of having lived within Black context pretty much until I got to grad school. And then also having people like Adolph Reed and Alex Willingham and Willie Leggett and Preston and, Michelle Boyd and all sorts of other fellow travelers, Touré, all along the way within academia who've kind of pushed me to think even more critically about Black political life. But I just think it's necessary now more than ever because we're living through a moment where we're hearing the same arguments that were made in the 1960s all over again, and with very little consideration for the over half century of history that's transpired in the interim. And so I think we really need this analysis now more than ever. Otherwise, we'll end up embracing a politics which will satisfy certain segments of the Black population, but ultimately won't address and won't staunch the bleeding for the people who need it most, which is the most submerged and dispossessed segments of the Black population and the Black working class.
Excellent.
Yeah, I can echo almost everything Cedric said. I mean, just like Cedric, I came to class analysis growing up in Southwest Atlanta and New Haven, Connecticut, right? My family's from New Orleans. And I spent my summers as a kid in New Orleans. But, my most of the days of my early childhood life were spent in Southwest Atlanta, which if you were familiar with TI's ATL, that's where it's set. And while ATL is not the reason that TI will burn in hell, that's Iggy Azalea. Still a terrible movie. But anyway, I can never resist the opportunity to say that whenever I bring it up. But among the most significant memories that I have that kind of pushed me to think about the unfairness of the world that Black people occupy, which is much the same unfair world that everybody else occupies, was growing up in Atlanta during the missing murdered children, crisis, right? And you could see then I was in grade school, and in fact, one of the kids who was murdered, Patrick Baltazar, who I didn't know personally, but we went to the same church, we were at the same boys club. He was a year older than me. Everybody in the city was of course touched by that, right? And kids were freaked out, and I was a kid, so I was freaked out. But you could see at the time, if you looked through it, the class skew of the reactions to the missing murdered children, and then of course because the victims were disproportionately, they're all Black boys, right? But they're disproportionately Black boys coming from lower income backgrounds, and that profoundly shaped, I think, the response, like who the victims were in a city with a Black mayor and a Black police chief, profoundly affected the response, right? And of course, once you got the sense that of what the motives were of the killer, at least presumed killer Wayne Williams, that too reflected the class sensibilities of the serial killer in question, right? And growing up between Southwest Atlanta, where everybody was Black, and New Haven, Connecticut, which is a majority Black and Puerto Rican city, but a very poor city. When I grew up there in the mid '80s, I had some experiences with the complexity of race and class in ways that were even more profound than the much more heavily segregated Atlanta. And I got to witness, I didn't know any white people. I didn't have any white peers in Atlanta. Teachers don't count. I had a couple white teachers, but when you're a kid, teachers aren't really people. So I didn't have any white peers until I was in Connecticut. And I'd hear how white people talked about Black people, right? And what the stereotypes were about Black people. I should say racist white people. And it struck me at a pretty early age, adolescence, that the racial discourse that people operated with was pregnant with class presumptions, right? I mean, because this is the era of underclass ideology, and what it meant to be Black, and to be a real Black person, I came to quickly see. was, again, someone who conformed to the stereotypes that Reagan spun, or the principal subjects in a John Singleton film or whatever, right? So, I got to see those things through lived experiences by actually living, just like Cedric, in majority Black spaces, exclusively Black spaces in Southwest Atlanta. And that profoundly informed my interest in trying to make sense of the complexities of outcomes, because I could see that there were Black people, my Black peers in Southwest Atlanta were being trained, if you will, to prepare to go to college, right, and to have careers as white collar professionals. My Black peers in New Haven, Connecticut, at least at the first high school that I went to, were being trained for nothing so glamorous or fulfilling, but instead appeared to be trained through the context. I'm going to use the phrase institutional racism, since that'll probably come up at some point. We're being trained, for lives in institutions, be it the military or jail. So Cedric's point there, I thought, was spot on, particularly the leadoff point that he made, where people often, suggest if you're a Black person who has a class analysis, that either you're conservative, which neither he nor I would be, or that you are inauthentically Black, meaning that you didn't grow up around Black people, which he and I both did. And for what it's worth, both my parents are HBCU alums, and 3 out of 4 of my grandparents are as well, if that matters. I don't think it should. But, we're at this moment, as Cedric said, or alluded to, in which any kind of class analysis is perceived as dismissive of the concerns of Black people. And this is what I've called the race reductionist moment. And rather than blathering on about that without a rudder, I think I'd like to explore that directly in the Q&A.
All right. That was very eloquent. You did all right. It was okay. I'm impressed. For now. It may not stand for that.
You gotta turn the volume down on your screen, Pascal. Your feedback.
I thought Pascal was trying to take us back to the DJing days. The block party.
hey, coming at you live.
Hold on 1 second.
Gaynell Harris said it sounded like you said Nikki Azalea, not Iggy Azalea. And I
did not. I said Iggy Azalea.
And then he said,
Is there less feedback now?
Yeah, you're good.
Good, yeah.
And to be candid with the audience, all of us are various levels of friends. Some of us are very close, and we riff on each other. I'm just antagonizing these guys. I consider them all friends. So, there's gonna be some snapping going back and forth here every now and then. You might,
If only you guys could see some of the
talking about Cedric Johnson's new wannabe Santa Claus beard and everything like that.
Is that your Corona beard, Sid? That's your Corona beard?
Basically, yeah.
Is that a common record in the background? Is that common?
It's common on one side. I got a few other ones back here too. So
is that like Water for Chocolate?
Yeah.
One of the cool things that I like about talking to Cedric and Touré is that we are all Generation X Black males. In other words, we are all either over or close to or at the 5-0 mark. And we remember the Reagan years as teenagers. We remember the Carter administration. We could probably, some of us still remember the Nixon administration. So the 50-year period that Cedric was talking about, what I call, and political science and historian, if I'm incorrect for using, I call it the 50-year counter-revolution, meaning this is the 50-year period of time from the rise of Nixon in which he implements policies, whether it be COINTELPRO, whether it be his cynical utilization of Black capitalism to get the Black middle class to basically implement a future agenda for Black politics that doesn't challenge capitalism at all, but basically institutionalized black politics into the traditional ruling class as what would be called as a kind of comprador relationship. Now, I realize there's a limitation to the comprador relationship because it assumes we get into the debates of are black people a colony of themselves, internal colonial theory, blah, 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 which some of our more radical nationalist black left comrades believe. But the larger point is that there is a kind of metaphor with the rise of the black political class that comes out of this period of the 70s with so much radical hopes and aspirations, which Cedric documents very well in his book, From Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, that becomes a conservative project of kind of ethnic patronage politics at a time in which, after the New Deal, there's not much patronage to give out in these cities that become deindustrialized. And I want to connect Touré's race reductionism to a specific question I have here. So we're going to go to that question, even though it's not number one in the list. But Touré, do you think that race reductionism is being promoted in this moment to push agendas for Black America that are actually capitalist philanthropy at their essence? Why is it that Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, will write extensively about closing the racial wealth gap, yet will not utter a word of support for federal jobs guarantee or universal health care? And is this not repetition ad absurdum of what we got from the Black Power era when it started to merge with the ruling class in the early 70s? In other words, are we seeing Black Power politics minus the change to capitalism all over again?
Yeah.
Well, we jump right into question 5. I mean, the people at home know the order, but I do. So I didn't even get my opportunity to warm up. What a way to end 2020. So I'll let Cedric deal with the Black Power point, right? Because I think that's in his wheelhouse. But
is it because he's got a beard now? You gonna fuck with him about the whole black? He got to be Black Power man.
That's Pascal. I shaved those after like 3 days.
That he made sure. All right, I'm gonna stop.
So so Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan have pledged like $30 billion to close the racial wealth gap or something like that. Right. And I think Dimon said, something to the effect that he was motivated by a desire to counter the systemic racism that the banking industry had been complicit in. So to answer your question, and that complicity goes back to redlining, right? So to answer your question, though, about why Dimon is willing to talk about systemic racism, but won't utter a word of support about federal jobs guarantees, universal health care, or all he does is really, think about, all you have to do to make sense of why this is going on is that think about the implications of the details of the pledge, right? So again, just to make sense of what's motivating Dimon to talk about systemic racism, all you got to do is think about the details of the pledge. And so the $30 billion that JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon have pledged, unless something changed, dispersed as loans for mortgages for Black and Hispanic homeowners, loans to real estate developers to build affordable housing, loans to small businesses to grow the wealth of the Black masses, as well as funding for, I think, entrepreneurial training courses too. And I think JP Morgan is also talking about working with Black suppliers. So there's some version of minority set-asides that's baked into this. So again, if you put all of that together, what you see is a vision of injustice, or for him, a vision of justice that presumes inequality in housing markets, but you could throw labor markets into this too, was or is an irrational exception to an otherwise rational capitalist system. So Black people within this framework were disadvantaged by racism, but not capitalism. So you make loans to real estate entrepreneurs than to build affordable housing, whatever that means actually. Or, you make loans to Black homeowners, or you give more contracts to minority suppliers, and you're done. So the fix that Dimon, But throw Elizabeth Warren into this too, because she co-signed some version of this as well when she was running for president. So the fix is not to reimagine the structure of housing markets. The fix is doing more to incorporate Black people into a housing market that really can't meet low income workers, whatever their race needs, right? So let me just play with this though. So I should be clear when I say that Diamond or Elizabeth Warren, for that matter, are saying Black people are disadvantaged by racism rather than capitalism. I'm not suggesting for a moment that Blacks weren't disadvantaged by racism in housing markets or at work. What I am saying though, is that the racial ideology was actually baked into the logic of capitalist housing markets. So you can't really distill the two. So even though some authors, I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but I definitely am, but I won't say who. Some authors have suggested that the federal government or the New Deal had imposed discriminatory housing practices on business. The truth is the FHA mortgage policy was written with input from the real estate and banking industry, right? Redlining specifically was written into HOLC FHA mortgage policy by Homer Hoyt, who had been chief economist of the National Association of Real Estate Boards. And redlining specifically was a way, redlining was drafted into law as a way specifically to minimize risks for investors. So what the New Deal did, and this is absolutely problematic, is it turned best business practices into law. So another way to put that is the real estate industry had already identified race before the New Deal as a factor in determining housing values. So what I'm getting at, if it's not clear, is that this was consistent with the logic. Racism in housing markets was consistent with the logic of capitalism. It wasn't some separate immoral or irrational framework like Jamie Dimon or Elizabeth Warren, let's say one more time, would want us to believe, or Ta-Nehisi Coates, or fill in the blank. So how does it work that racism is baked into the housing market? I had an exchange with a buddy of mine this morning, coincidentally on Facebook, and I'll see if I can replicate what I said to him. If, let's say, millions of people believe that Blacks, Jews, Hispanics, etc., were inferior races, as would have been the case as people would have believed in the 19 teens and 20s, right? So if millions of people believe that Blacks, Jews, Hispanics, fill in the blank, were inferior races, that by their nature, Blacks, Jews, Hispanics, etc., were incapable of maintaining high living standards and were alleged to be happier living amongst themselves, then for millions of Americans, residential segregation would have been appropriate, right? It would have been just, it would have been moral within that context. Same, of course, for wage discrimination. So as lots of other people have pointed out, racism didn't actually taint an otherwise rational functioning housing market or labor market, but instead in the era of mature racial ideology, like in the teens and 1920s, racially tiered housing markets were baked into the rational logic of capitalist markets. That doesn't mean that racial discrimination was right, but it does mean that factoring in the race of renters or homeowners when determining property values, let's say, was for a bunch of people who embraced the realness of race just as logical from a capitalist economic standpoint as considering a prospective homeowners or renters credit score or income or occupation or education or how long they've had a job or whatever. So what the hell does this have to do with Jeremy Dimon? If it's not clear, so I'll just tie that up. So for someone like Dimon, systemic racism or structural racism, and the question is, why is he going to talk about systemic racism or structural racism? And I think those are two versions of the same thing, but not talk about social democratic policies. Skip how he makes his money, but just thinking about this in terms of ideology. So for someone like Jeremy Dimon, systemic racism, structural racism, whatever you want to call it, offer a vocabulary for explaining racial disparities that actually abstracts racial disparities from capitalism. And I got to say this because Pascal, I think, will give me shit if I don't. I should stress this is one of the things that I don't like about systemic or structural racism. I think, for what it's worth, I also think that structural racism and systemic racism as constructs lend themselves to individualist solutions to societal problems. But I got to make the point or put out there, since I know a lot of people were animated by my having said in a different interview not too long ago that I would like to see systemic racism or structural racism retired and constructs like that, because I think that those constructs don't really do Black people or working class or poor Black people anyway a solid, and they certainly don't do a solid to progressives. That again, this is where I see those constructs as problematic. Jeremy Diamond's attached to them because they function as escape hatches in making sense of the sources of inequality that impact disproportionately poor and working class people. And one thing that I think Cedric said, but I want to amplify, is that what motivates Cedric's and my research is absolutely an investment, I think, in the struggles of Black people. But I think Cedric and I are particularly invested in the struggles of poor and working class Black people rather than, rich Black people. And I think, again, these constructs do the devil's work if you're interested in the struggles of poor and working class Black people. They do great work for Oprah. They do great work for Obama. They do great work for, what's his name, Robert Johnson. Remember him?
Blues player?
What? No, not the blues player. The Robert Johnson. There's Smith and Johnson, right?
The guy that owned BET.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's Robert Smith. And
Robert Smith.
Was Robert Smith?
Robert Smith is the guy we recently learned was basically, allegedly, a glorified money launderer for the largest tax evasion case in American history.
He was part of the Panama Papers?
No. That basically his seed money for his investment, Robert Smith, was received as a package for a man who was engaged in the greatest tax evasion case in American history, allegedly.
I'm just going with Black billionaire rather than money launderer.
He's the guy that gave the money to the kids, right? He's like, all you Negroes get free college, right?
And he's, yes. Was it Morehouse?
Yeah.
Yes.
But I would also say, because I think Pascal might like me to say this, I do, even though I'm not crazy about structural racism or systemic racism, which again I think are the same thing. I hope we're
crazy about racism.
Laid out. I actually still use institutional racism with caveat, and I have literally described FHA mortgage policy as a clear expression of institutional racism. There's an institution that you can point to that pursued a policy that had a negative effect on Black people that was explicitly racist, right? So I could point to that and say, bam, there it is. That's institutional racism. Structural racism is a lot more amorphous, though.
To try to be fair to your argument, that's causing a lot of our fans to look at you side-eye right now, like, structural racism. What?
I think this is a safe space for you to say, I don't like if this is a
what
safe
you're
space.
saying, correct me if I'm wrong. Are you saying that institutional racism as a concept is more an effective way to talk about how certain institutions disadvantage not generally particularly poor and working class Black people, but also even Black people overall, such as FHA mortgages are going to be more the poor and working class, but we can say the prison industrial complex, contact their disproportionalities and police treatment. Now, of course, we could say that we can analyze those numbers in terms of, the data that's been recently showed out, but you saying that using systemic or structural racism obscures an understanding of what is the institutional mechanism of capitalism that is causing this percentage who's largely poor and working class blacks to be oppressed, because you just say it's the system and that's what it is.
The devil made me do it. I mean, practically, it's the devil made me do it. And here's how I'm gonna hammer at this.
And this is vintage. This is why, let me tell you why I enjoy talking to Touré, right? Touré, not to big him up, because he's a pain in the ass just like everybody else. But Touré is comes from 3 generations of black people who study black people. His father was a respected political scientist. His grandfather was a respected political scientist. And I'm not saying that for us to have some kind of class allegiance, like, oh, these people are so wonderful. Not at all. It's that because the one thing I admire about their tradition of looking, the Reed tradition of looking at black people, is that it's not stuck in this kind of we as a people, us as a people, my people, we all in this together. It's based on the kind of analysis that says, no, we have black people who have used the charade of racial unity to stick a shiv in the back of large numbers of black people over and over and over again. And we're alive to this. And we are saying that this may want to make you rethink of the we as a people, us as a people, my people shtick with much more circumspection. Would that be a fair assessment of the Reed tradition, Touré?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. But would you be cool with my expanding on the devil made me do it part of?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, shit.
All you got to do is get in the Wayback Machine, which I know Jason is fond of, and go back to those halcyon days of the 2016 Democratic primaries and reflect on the way that Hillary Clinton used the language of systemic racism and implicit bias, actually, to deflect attention from her complicity in policies, her husband's policies, that disproportionately impacted black people negatively. So, for example, I can't remember which debate it was, but I'm pretty sure I was in Fayetteville, Arkansas, when I watched this debate. Not that matters to anybody but my dad if he's watching. But she had said, in one of the debates, she came at Sanders about his calls for banking regulation, and she said something to the effect that regulating Wall Street would do nothing to address the problems of systemic racism.
Yes,
contributed to the mortgage crisis. And if you have any sense,
say it again for the people with seats in the back.
So one more time, she said, coming at Sanders.
Who is this? Hillary Clinton, correct?
Hillary Rodham Clinton.
In 2016, correct?
2016. In one of the Democratic primary debates, she said that that Sanders' calls for regulation of the banking industry, Wall Street, would do nothing to redress the problems of systemic racism that had hobbled African Americans. And I can't recall if she made a direct reference to the mortgage crisis at that point. But the thing that was absolutely jacked up about it is that Bill Clinton, her husband's complicity in the deregulation of the banking industry in 1999 with the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act had quite a bit to do with black people having been disproportionately, but clearly not exclusively, devastated by the subprime mortgage crisis. So the fact of the matter is that while technically regulation of the banking industry had nothing to do with race, the deregulation of the banking industry had a disproportionate impact on black people, right? She used systemic racism as the escape hatch to distance herself, right, from her own complicity in policies that, one more time, that technically had nothing to do with race, but had a disproportionate impact on black people, right? And it became that wasn't the clearest expression of the devil made me do it, but the clearest expression of the devil made me do it update was the way that she used the language of implicit bias to explain her super predator bullshit, right? And she said and that was racist. No question about that super predator stuff. being racist. But what was her escape hatch from that? She was suffering from the original sin of racism that has hobbled Americans and everybody else for a millennia. And she literally did say that obviously America has not been around for millennia, but she literally did say that racism has hobbled us for millennia. And again, the problem was she just wasn't alive to the implications of what she was saying because of her, white privilege or implicit bias and whatever.
Oh my God.
Right? That's bullshit. She wasn't alive to it because she had shitty politics, right? That's why she wasn't alive to it. It wasn't that she'd suffered from the original sin of racism. It's that she had terrible politics, and lots of people paid a price for her husband's terrible politics.
Do you know what's fascinating? We got echo.
Oh, is it me with
You
that?
got one more time to turn the volume up.
Who needs to turn the volume up?
I keep turning it down. I keep having to turn it down. Okay, you know what's fascinating here? We're basically talking about how liberals, literally the modern manifestation of neoliberalism, hyper-privatization and marketization in the Democratic Party, the Clintons, are so worse. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was so adept at using anti-racist language that she would use it to weaponize against legitimate critiques of policies her own husband implemented that damaged Black people significantly. And these are anti-racist talking points that many Black quote-unquote liberals on the left will fight for and will cling to say, no, this is the best description. Let me ask a question. Does anti-racist discourse, which by the way often starts in academia, does that get created, gentlemen, outside the wheelhouse of the liberal foundation world? In other words, does this stuff exist outside of white capital deciding what is better for them in terms of their overall goal of keeping capitalism function?
And you're talking like white fragility and stuff like that, and how to be an anti-racist and implicit bias training and be nice to your Black coworker kind of stuff in the workplace like that.
I think that's an example, but the kind of talking points that Hillary was using in that debate and subsequent ones, a lot of those terms started in academia. What I'm saying is that, is there that much of a space between how these terms are given agency and the connection with the foundation world and funding research, discourse, who gets grants for their studies? I'm curious. Enlighten me. I'm asking.
Are you trying to make them call out their fellow academics who they have to sit there in a meeting with and be like, I saw you on the live stream the other day talking about my grift?
Yeah, I mean, let me take it up. I think so. I wouldn't put it all on academics, right? Even though that's a major locus of a lot of the ideas, the terminology, some of the the kind of social entrepreneurship that we see in motion right now. A lot of it does have its origins in that migration of new left politics into academia. So the foundations are there, no doubt. But when thinking about Black Lives Matter and the way that anti-racism has become so dominant to the extent that, Hillary Clinton would embrace it in the way that Touré described, Joe Biden has already used the term systemic racism multiple times, before and after he was elected. I think in thinking about that phenomenon, we got to dig a little bit deeper. So it's not just a function of academia. I mean, there still is a way in which a particular kind of anti-racist politics is appealing. It operates at such a high level of abstraction that it helps people to understand or think they understand certain things about the society at this particular historical moment. So I would actually argue that Black Lives Matter as a phenomenon is not just a response to policing, right? Policing and videotaped video recorded police killings becomes the vehicle for it. But I think the foundations of it are much deeper, right? They come before Ferguson, before even
Trayvon.
the killing of Trayvon Martin, even before the killing of Oscar Grant. If we can go back to like the Hurricane Katrina disaster, some of that rhetoric is already animating people and how they understand what happened in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, right? That becomes the most immediate and ready way of understanding the disaster, even though, as many people pointed out, the first among them, as I already evoked Adolf already, but here's a second site. People should go back and look at the things that he wrote in the immediate aftermath after Katrina, because he was one of the first people to point out that race didn't really help us to understand who was left behind. It didn't necessarily help us to understand purely who was drowned and who was saved, who was able to rebuild, and who was essentially banished from the city, and the kind of reconstruction that took place. That it really was about a kind of politics that we have to spend time thinking about, and again, to go back to what Touré was saying, we can use terms like systemic racism. They kind of catch-all phrases for some people. They don't always help us to understand what's happening historically, right? They're kind of an easy way for us to talk about processes that deserve study, right? And that's not just for bourgeois people to deal with. I think everybody, working class people, study. We pay attention to what's going on in the world. I know the people I grew up around, who were mostly sharecroppers and domestic and manual laborers, they had opinions about the world. They talked about local class politics. So I don't think this is just an academic exercise. But I think what we see happening with the Katrina disaster, and I think this is refracted through social media, and social media plays an important role in reproducing some of the rhetoric that would give us Black Lives Matter. Racism becomes an easy way to corral a number of different disruptions that are caused by neoliberalization, right? So there's, on the one hand, the weakening of the social safety net, decades in the making, which can be understood by some people, at least characterized through that, because we can see the ways in which it affects Black people in cities. The demolition of public housing across the country, the kinds of disruptions that produce for neighborhoods, the ways in which people are moved off the welfare rolls and into oftentimes, mandatory jobs that are low wage and meaningless in so many ways, are banished to schools that are failing in central cities. So there's a way in which a number of these different disruptions of neoliberalization, the rollback of the old social welfare state, is summarized by a particular kind of anti-racist politics, right? It's the way in which some people make sense of the world, right? What they're seeing in neighborhoods, young people being rounded up by cops. They're seeing people being harassed under this new policing regime that's rolled out alongside the removal of the welfare state. And I think that's part of where Black Lives Matter begins. So it's not just an academic phenomenon, but it's also the ways in which those older discourses of racial justice are used to understand the world that we're in. And it's academics. It's also the old civil rights organizations, but even at a local level and at an everyday level, it's the ready discourse that's available to us to make sense of what's happening, and what's, reaches a dramatic manifestation in terms of the Katrina disaster, but also in terms of the subprime mortgage crisis. So it's inadequate. I want to reiterate that it's not helpful. We have to dig deeper to really understand what these problems are about, or where their origins are, that they come from public policy, that they're not just a result of sort of never-ending white racism, but rather the dismantling of the social welfare state was a result of years of public policy work, years of lobbying by different kinds of historical actors. And those actors were a combination of folks. They weren't just whites or even very powerful whites. They also included Black politicians, right? We've talked about this in other venues, even in terms of understanding the carceral buildup. It's too easy to explain it. Not only it's too easy, and it's also inaccurate to explain it primarily in terms of white backlash or even white fears about crime, because a lot of the policies that were passed at the local level were passed by Black mayoral regimes, right? And Black legislative regimes in cities, city council majorities in cities. The last thing I'll say, and maybe this is just kind of an add-on to this comment about anti-racism and why it's gained so much traction during this time of Black Lives Matter. I think we have to get back to thinking about interests. This is one of the things I start with on the first day of class whenever I'm teaching most of the classes that I have, at UIC. And that's to have students think about interests in really concrete ways. What are political interests? That's the question you should ask yourself. How do we understand political interests historically? When we're in this high-flying space of Facebook and social media, there's a tendency for people to engage in ventriloquism and to assign the interests that they think people harbor to broad swaths of the population, right? So we think about rural whites as having certain interests. We think about Blacks as having certain interests without necessarily having to qualify those. And it's really, in many ways, I mean, for the work that I do, it's insulting. It is degrading to real populations, and it just flattens out the complexity, right? I mean, when we think about interests, we're thinking about two things. What people want is one way to think about it. We're also thinking about it in terms of what kind of world do people want at a more abstract or ideological level. And when I'm in a room with people, I've done this whenever I've given talks at different universities. When you're in a room with about 400 people, you cannot possibly say that you understand the interests of all of those people in the room, right? You can't understand, you can't possibly summarize what all of those people want. And by that, I mean, what sort of life do they want? What kinds of public policies do they want to see passed, right? You can't really summarize those things within a breath, but people do that routinely when it comes to African Americans, right? We're constantly sort of assigning what Black interests are without any sort of investigation, without any sort of analysis. We also do the same thing to working class whites. I think we have to stop that. I think that's one of the things that allows a particular kind of overly simplistic politics to flourish in so many spaces, and it just doesn't serve us well. So as an add-on, we should keep coming back to this question of interest. I think it's one way to diffuse some of these high-flying and unhelpful discussions about history and contemporary Black political life.
Can I amplify a point that Cedric made? This will be off the top of my head, so forgive me. Cedric's point about the ways that opportunity structures shape, and I'm going to paraphrase this, and you'll correct me if I'm butchering the formulation, Cedric, but Cedric made an important point about opportunity structures shaping the way that people define, and Black people and everyone else define their interests. And I think, is that a reasonable way to describe what you were getting at, Cedric?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
So that's hugely important. And I don't think we pay enough attention to it. And I can actually connect this to a degree to an elaboration on a point about institutional racism. There it is, that someone had actually asked in the question, I forget who. But in the 1930s and 40s, for example, the New Deal had a profound impact on the way that Black people defined their political interests, right? I mean, Blacks were impacted disproportionately by the Great Depression, even though the Great Depression technically has got nothing to do with race. Where Blacks were in labor markets and housing markets certainly meant, and because of racism, right? But certainly meant that Blacks were impacted disproportionately negatively by the Great Depression, right? It had much higher rates of unemployment and poverty and homelessness, et cetera. The New Deal, since the New Deal was conceived as a means of writing a listing capitalist economy by creating a kind of more sustainable model of capitalism, ensuring that workers had some portion, had a fairer share, maybe not a fair share, but a more fair share of capitalism's rewards, because workers would then spend that money and then fuel capitalist growth, right? that would have a profound effect on the ways that Black Americans defined their interests, right? The fact that the New Deal, again, sort of privileged labor as protected speech and the rights of working people to demand, more equal treatment, and the fact that Blacks were impacted disproportionately as well by the Great Depression led Black Americans in the 1930s and 40s to define, on the whole, their interests quite differently than Blacks would in the teens and 20s, or for that matter, after Black Power, insofar as Black Americans tended to define their political interests more in terms of working class politics, which included the right to collective bargaining, but the right to collective bargaining by way of interracial trade unionism, both on principle and they did the math on it, right? Blacks are 10% of the population. 10% of the population is going to lose every time in a democracy unless that 10% is comprised of rich people. In the 1960s, though, it's going to be another expression of progressive politics, but it's going to be a very different expression of progressive politics in some ways, and in some ways, economically, a more conservative expression of liberalism. And so the war on poverty doesn't look very much like the New Deal at all, for a variety of reasons. And what happens is that, and this is going to, I'm going to explore for a second the way the political opportunity structures shape the way that Black people define their interests. There's a debate over what, in the early 1960s, over what anti-discrimination policy should look like. And the debate, sort of oscillated between two anti-discrimination policies, Senate Bill S 1937, which actually was kind of New Deal-like, and then what's going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is Title VII. And S 1937, which was a lot closer in many ways to what Black activists in the March on Washington had been calling for, which was not just anti-discrimination policies, not just anti-discrimination in workplace and housing policies, but that was certainly those are part of the demands of the 1963 March on Washington. But actually, the organizers of the March on Washington were also calling for New Deal style policies, right? Targeting, of course, poor and working class people, but they were basically interracial policies. But anyway, so S 1937 didn't just have an anti-discrimination component, it actually had a jobs creation component. And for a variety of reasons, S 1937 lost ground to Title VII. In the aftermath, and Title VII's, not a bad thing. I think all of us involved in this medium here are beneficiaries of Title VII. I certainly understand myself to be a beneficiary of Title VII. And as well as, I understand myself to be a beneficiary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, for what it's worth. They're good things, but they were inadequate. And partly because they did not address the transformation of the American economy from a blue collar economy to a white collar, high tech service economy, which had a disproportionate impact on Blacks, partly because of residential segregation owed to FHA policy. So there's that, right? But again, Title VII or the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68 didn't address that. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964, unlike S 1937, was the bill that passed. And in the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's clear that the Johnson administration isn't really going to push for a kind of New Deal, return to sort of New Deal liberalism, insofar as it was loath to intervene in labor markets the way that the New Dealers had intervened in labor markets. And thus the Johnson administration wasn't invested in direct job creation, which was going to benefit Blacks disproportionately, though not exclusively. How did Black activists begin to define more and more their demands? They began to define their demands more and more in terms of race exceptionalist frameworks and less in terms of race and class. And so it's in the aftermath, right? It's no coincidence that it's in the second half of the 1960s that we get institutional racism as a construct to explain the disproportionate disadvantages that Blacks faced in housing and labor markets. And it's not that institutional racism as a construct is completely without merit. Like I said, I use it. So I wouldn't suggest for a moment that it is completely without merit if I use it. But even institutional racism has its limitations. I see a number of questions, so I'll shut up there. But I just wanted to amplify what Cedric was getting at. And there are a couple of New Deal questions that might be.
Yeah, they're coming at you. I'd like to take some of the questions of my my good friend Janice Graham, also a good friend to Touré as well. Janice asks the question, how do you then resolve the critical impact of dependency on an economy in which Black people participate significantly different? At the New Deal, if whites were not working, Blacks were adversely affected by it. Title VII and the FHA Act, and neither are still numb for Black people, and EO, Executive Order 11246. I'd like you, if you can elaborate. Or
a little more clarification on the front end New Deal question. And I guess maybe if you show that to me again.
I think Cedric had something to say too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You wanted to answer that question, Cedric? How do you then resolve the critical impact of dependency on an economy in which Black people participate significantly different?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a stab at it. I don't know. I mean, I think I'll start by saying I think we on one level we should learn from the New Deal experience, right? But also we should, as Touré has done in his own work, understand the unique context in which the New Deal was created, what particular forces were at play at the time, the ways in which radical trade union or labor movements were able to impress upon the New Deal a certain direction. So there's things that we can take away from it clearly. I actually think public works, which did benefit Black people during the New Deal period, both in the form of the Works Progress Administration and also the Civilian Conservation Corps, are still valuable ideas. I mean, public works pretty much disappears from the repertoire of possible solutions to questions of joblessness in the post-war period as we make this more sharp turn towards a commercial Keynesianism, right, and a reliance on private contractors to do the work of infrastructure development in the country, right? So we shift from a policy or a practice during the New Deal, which is publicly funded and publicly managed jobs programs, towards a posture which we're still in now, really takes shape, I think, and strengthens during the post-war era of contracting. Federal monies are then doled out to local private contractors who then engage in private hiring schemes for infrastructure development. I think if we go back to that older model during the New Deal, where there's at least some chance of fairness and equal protection for all citizens and people who need assistance and need gainful employment, we could have something that works, right? That may alleviate some of the dependency that Janice is alluding to in that message. But I think we have to, I guess to go back to my original point, we don't have to be bound by whatever mistakes were made historically by the New Dealers, or even by Great Society liberals, or even the democratic neoliberals, right? I mean, I think we have to be more creative in terms of thinking about what kind of world do we want? What sort of strategies and policies should we be pursuing at this particular juncture? And, I'm for one, I'm kind of fatigued on it. And that's not a response to Janice. It's more of a broad, maybe a broad exhaustion about this particular year and what it's meant by what ends up being a defeatist posture, right? Where we assume that because things couldn't be achieved historically, that somehow this political moment is also equally moribund, right? It's limited, it's chained by whatever happened in the past. And I think we certainly have to recognize and accept the real limitations that are in front of us. but we should also have the courage to think about what's possible and to not be limited by what happened in other periods, right? I think that this is a new moment. There's a different balance of class forces. There are new corners of the society that are awakened, and that are demanding something different. I don't have a Pollyannish view about what this all means, but I just think that we have to think about his history in a way that's critical, right? That mines those aspects that might be helpful, but also understands that we're no longer in those particular junctures, right? That we're in a completely new historical moment that has its own possibilities and limitations that we should also be working hard to understand.
Cedric, I'd like to go.
Can I amplify? Can I get in there just a little bit? As a guest,
a professional amp tonight, brother. Okay.
Well, it is what it is, because I like Cedric's response, and I want to just amplify the point. The point that Cedric makes, that we don't have to be bound by the particulars of the New Deal or the Great Society, is spot on. And I'm not advocating that we do the New Deal as was. I don't think that's in the offing. I don't think anybody is advocating that or has been advocating it. John LBJ, for what it's worth, and this isn't worth much, it's owed partly to the fact that I was born in the 70s rather than the 50s or 60s. LBJ is my favorite president because of the race man in me, right? FDR, I think, is the best president of the modern era, but LBJ was the greatest. So
what about when LBJ grew out that ponytail towards the end?
Best thing having the LBJ
acknowledge shit like that.
Vietnam. Vietnam's a really good reason to not like LBJ. And that's why my father and I had a little divide for a while. And to be fair, I was almost born in Canada. For a reason, but anyway, so the point that I'm getting at, though, is since no one would advocate, one of the reasons I wouldn't advocate return to the New Deal as it was because there was no Civil Rights Act of 1964 or Voting Rights Act of 1965 or Civil Rights Act of 1968 in 1935, right? So whatever I would advocate for, like by definition, whatever I would advocate for wouldn't be class first. And I've heard people suggest that one of the things that I've been arguing, and I bet Cedric's heard this too, is people have suggested, and this is imputing to me an argument I have never, nor would I ever make, that Touré Reed is suggesting that what we need to do is class first and then come back and do race. I've never argued that anywhere in print, verbally, even drunk at a damn bar. I would never say that.
What a weird drunk conversation to have, though.
I have those kinds of conversations at bars when I'm drunk. It's been a while, though.
Keep you not drunk then.
But I would never advocate that because it's, among other things, it's stupid. Because it wouldn't, just to be blunt, because doing that wouldn't capture all of the problems that impact Blacks disproportionately. Just like anti-discrimination policies, period, don't address the problems that impact Blacks disproportionately. And they can't. That's one of the reasons the war on poverty failed. It had some successes, but the war on poverty never set out, and Cedric had alluded to this, to eliminate poverty per se, right? Because one of the things that was off the table, because Johnson was not FDR, commercial Keynesianism is kind of the precursor to trickle down. One of the things that was off the table was direct intervention in labor markets in the form of public works, right? But you got to have some elements if we want to eliminate Black poverty, let's say, and that's what I'm interested in, right? I don't care if there are more Black billionaires. I don't think there should be any billionaires, to be honest.
Even if they're Black.
Whatever their race, a world without billionaires with a B sounds pretty good to me. But anyway, I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is making sure that pretty much all Black people and pretty much all Americans, no matter what their race or ethnicity, can basically live middle-class, comfortable lives, right? And I don't think a world of billionaires actually gives you that. I don't think it can. So again, I mean, no one's suggesting, I'm certainly not suggesting, that we got to do class first and then come back to do race. You have to do both simultaneously because Black people are impacted, right, by labor markets and housing markets for which, and this is my initial point, racial ideology, among other things, and among a host of other things, are actually baked into it, right? Housing valuation, as I started off with, was shaped by racial ideology, which was part of the logic of capitalist labor housing markets, just as labor markets, capitalist labor markets, were informed by racial ideology. There's a logic there. It's not irrational at all. It's jacked up. It's anti-democratic. It's literally racist. I guess the stumbling block that I'd had with the front end of Janice's question, which I think Cedric's comments helped clarify for me somewhat, was the notion that Blacks, I guess, and I'll butcher the formulation, had a very different experience in labor markets during the New Deal, right? So how do you then resolve the critical impact of dependency on an economy in which Black people participate significantly different? I guess it was the significantly different part that was kind of a stumbling block for me because I wasn't quite sure what that meant. Partly because I'm not sure that there are differences, right? There's certainly differences in the experience of, let's say, Black workers in the 1930s. Of course, it's not 2020, but there are certainly experiences of Black workers, differences in the experiences of Black workers in the 1920s and 30s from white. But there's a hell of a lot of overlap. And so one of the things that comes to mind with this is, when one of the critiques of the New Deal is that Social Security Act, people often say was racist, and it certainly was marred by a lot of problems. And people point to the fact that from 1935 until the early 1950s, the majority of Blacks were excluded because of the exemptions in Social Security coverage pertaining to domestic and agricultural workers. But the funny thing about that is, and this is why, again, the notion that Blacks participated in an economy significantly differently maybe, but I'm not sure how significantly. The funny thing about that is the majority of workers who were excluded from the Social Security Act were white, right? Yeah, Black people were overrepresented. 23% of the workers who were excluded from the Social Security Act by way of those provisions were Black, but 74% of the workers who were excluded from the Social Security Act by way of the exemptions for domestic and personal servants and agricultural workers, 74% of those workers who were excluded were white, right? And it's not that the plantation owners basically opposed extension of Social Security benefits to workers no matter what their race for a variety of reasons, all of which are kind of standard capitalist reasons. But the plantation owners also opposed extension of Social Security to themselves. Black people face this work discrimination in the industrial sector. It's also true, for what it's worth, that racially tiered labor markets disadvantaged a lot of white people, just as racially tiered housing markets disadvantaged a lot of white people too. So, for example, I guess I'll pick on the housing again for a hot second. Because of the way that race was baked into the valuation of housing markets in the logic of capitalism, right? Just like checking your credit score, whether or not you have a job or how long you've had a job or whatever, white people paid extra money because, again, this is consistent with the valuation of housing. White people paid extra money to live far away from Black people or Jews or Mexicans or whomever who would drive down property values, right? White people lost money when when blockbusters moved Black renters or homeowners into white neighborhoods, one more time, because of the way that the real estate industry and then FHA, HOLC, FHA, VA valued properties in which race was baked into the valuation. Those white people also lost money from those valuations. I guess what I'm getting at, and probably not the smoothest way, is that the only people who actually benefited from those racially tiered housing market were real estate entrepreneurs. Even the white homeowners didn't benefit from that. Yes, they experienced yes, the way that they experienced capitalist housing markets was different, but they were impacted by race too, by the logic of race, and paid a price for it. A price that was nowhere near as great as Black people, is not equal, and I'm not suggesting that. But the point is that the logic here is not something that necessarily benefited white people per se, because they got impacted negatively by it too if they were homeowners. It benefited real estate entrepreneurs, right? So it's complicated.
Well, it is complicated too, because Lorraine Hansberry, that's how her father made his fortune, was fixing up what they call the Kitchenette King was his name, turning these little shacks into houses. So basically taking the whole apartment complexes and subdividing them even smaller, and he made a fortune doing that. You know, Touré, you and I have talked about markets. So he found a market, and he went for it.
Right.
So.
Do you guys mind if I actually ask a question from our list of questions that we
okay? Here's the situation, and I'm going to ask our guests this, and I'm going to ask you this too, Pascal. Sorry, I have a friend named Pasquale, so I always apologize if I call you the wrong name. It's 7:30.
10:30 my time.
We said we were going to go. Sorry. We said we were going to go an hour and a half. We didn't get on some of the really good end of the year questions that I definitely wanted to get into with these two cats. And I know you wanted to get into it. And we have this sweet RoboCop clip. Keep up.
Well, this question is important to me because to me this is about the future of the Black left. If there is one, what's going to be one? That's why.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna leave the 4 squares up.
Okay, this is the question.
That just when the 4 squares is up, just letting you know, shit talky when the 4 squares is up.
Here's the question. I've said for over 4 years now that the fulcrum of Black electoral politics today exists to the right of white progressives, and this development is both unprecedented and evidence of how much Black politics has moved rightward in the age of neoliberalism in the post-civil rights era. Regardless of what we think about him, with Bernie Sanders being neutralized by Congressman James Clyburn's marshaling his constituents into supporting candidates in 2016 and 2020 who represented the neoliberal churn in the Democratic Party, can we admit that there will be no left politics in America without the cultivation of a large number of Black citizens reclaiming Black left or Black progressive politics? That's the question.
Touré went and got a notebook, so you know he was prepared for your ass on this one.
Not that one. I was just looking to see which one it was. And it was on like the 3rd page or whatever.
He was like, I got some heat for your ass.
No, I think that's Cedric's question.
That's a Cedric question. Is that why game face on?
That's a Cedric question. That's a direct in the gut, right to you. Boom. Cedric question.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, so I was looking at Janice's comment about what Black left.
Right.
Other than the 4 square.
That's Joyanne Reed. Who else in the Black left? What's the brother y'all love from Maryland?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah, that name.
Oh, please listen, man. As someone who writes for like one of the few Black left publications, don't put those fools with us, man. Don't seriously. Let us live the fantasy of believing that we actually have a Black left, and just live in that space. But don't put us with those people, man. Come on, man.
So
one of the large
stab at it, though.
One of the things that I want to say, right? So this is important because Touré, you talk about this in your book on race reductionism, how effectively Black media figures in the service of neoliberal Democrats actively took a shotgun to this quote-unquote progressive politics in the name of producing some of the most horrendous Democratic Party players in bringing forth neoliberalism in the last 50 years. And my larger question is, why was it so easy and effective for people like Jason Johnson or people like Joanne Reed to create this perception, this ahistorical perception that left politics is a white thing? Who dropped the ball in that endeavor?
Like which black person dropped the ball?
Who in general? The blame can go to several places.
So I'll lead off, and then we can wrap it up. So a couple things. I mean, I think one, we give Joy Reid and some of these other people too much airtime, right? I actually don't think. I mean, if I go home to Louisiana right now, go back home, and I ask people I went to high school with, folks who I grew up with, people in my family, if they know Joy Reid, they don't know her. Maybe they may have seen her show once, but I don't think she has as much hold over them as she might, with a black, chattering class or black political elites, right, who want to be on her show, right? So I think
the black petite bourgeois watcher,
huh?
The black petite bourgeois watcher,
right? They watch her, but I think a lot of working class black people are not really going to her. They're not necessarily shaping. She's not shaping their political views. I think if there's to be a future, I wouldn't talk about it so much as a future of black left, but I think across the board, both among African Americans, but in the broader population, if we're going to have a left, it has to be clearly and coherently anti-capitalist at this point, right? And I think we see moments of that. There's flashes of it over the last 20 plus years, going back to like the anti-globalization, protests of the late 90s and early 2000s. We see flare-ups every now and then. There's definitely been a revitalization of some certain, unions, different sectors across the country. That doesn't really get covered on. That doesn't get covered on Joy Reid, right? So I think we have to look for those sorts of struggles and pay attention to those more so than the kind of shadow theater that happens and echo chambers on, corporate news media and on Facebook. I mean, I just think that that's where the real struggles are. And I think to concretize an anti-capitalism is the real challenge for us at this particular moment, right? Because we can have these conversations. We can talk about the New Deal. We can talk about, decommodification of housing, public works, all these other good things. Again, when I go back to Louisiana, I don't hear people talking about that stuff, right? They're not talking about it. They're not even talking about it if I drive, through certain, to certain neighborhoods here in Chicagoland. So I think that's the task that's before us, right? Is to engage in a kind of left politics which doesn't get bogged down in the nomenclature, of anti-capitalism, while at the same time being meaningfully anti-capitalist in people's lives, right? If that makes any sense. I mean, I think that's the task as I see it.
Do you want to add in, Touré?
That's a hard task, though, because capitalism is so kind of baked in.
We have no institute. I mean, and listen, Cedric, you may disagree with me. That's okay. I still kind of respect you. But I want to say is that I think it's important to have a black left, not because I believe black people are magical or black people have super ninja political dust or they have inner knowing. I believe very simply that we need a black left because black politics is a class politics. And the class politics it works for is not the class of the majority of black people. And if we do not have a black left politics, we will have the same kind of politics that will be used to destroy left politics in this country in the name of neoliberalism and blackface. And I think the failure of whatever black leftists that we have, and partly it doesn't help the fact that, we have a large part of the old black left was taken out with COINTELPRO or got sucked into the ruling class through black capitalism or for a variety of reasons. We understand that too. Or maybe some of our comrades are stuck in politics that ranges between 1966 and 1972 and have not got out of that historical silo. That's part of a problem. But one thing has to be said is that we need to cultivate a younger generation of young, old, not just young, because we shouldn't fetishize youth either. Young, old, working class, union, non-union black people. And for me, the mechanism I use is exposing them to the tradition of black socialists, communists, union workers, labor organizers of the 20s, 30s, and 40s that no one tells black people about.
But here, okay, so I interviewed Chris Smalls, and we actually had a long conversation. I like Chris Smalls. I really dig what he's doing. And part of our conversation was, first of all, it wasn't, I've seen him on quite a few shows, and people almost talk to him like he's a magical Negro sometimes because of the shows that he's on. And I think he has an understanding of that, right? I believe the brother's pretty sharp. And I wanted to just get his background story so people could understand who he is and where he's from. Mm-hmm. So you understand he's not magical. He's just like you. And another thing that I thought was real interesting was we both at the time were working in similar environments where our environments were deadly. I want to say he had like 6 or so, maybe even 8 people die at the warehouse he was at from COVID. And the reason why I left the shelter I was at was because of COVID outbreaks and them not letting us know that we're working with COVID positive coworkers. And trying to get people that come from a certain station to understand that this is wrong, regardless of the dollars per hour you're getting, is very hard. And I wanted to hear Chris, and I wanted him to tell his story about where the warehouse was. It was in the hood. And the cats that worked at the warehouse were shooters, pimps, hoes, because they was making $19 an hour. And that was like, that's a lot of money where he's from. You know how hard it is to tell a person like that, hey man, this job is kind of fucking us. You know what I'm saying? Like that, and for him to be able to organize and get to where he's gotten so far, I think is pretty impressive. But I feel like he's on a bit of an island as well, because who else is out there doing that work with him? All these people that could be doing the work with him want to have internet fights about forcing votes and playing make-believe politics on fucking Twitter and Facebook.
So can I chime in?
Yeah.
I think Cedric had written about this, but more than once. But I would say that to take this back to the point about a black left, I mean, there is grist for the mill here to work with. And I think, let's say, while the Sanders campaign flamed out, in South Carolina, just like it did, in 2020, much like it did in 2016, what was kind of interesting about 2020, and again, I think Cedric has written about this very specific point, is that clearly clientage politics has something to do with it, right? I mean, clearly the black leadership class, in the case of James Clyburn, was able to work his magic, and it isn't magic, right? As I think the point that Cedric made is that Clyburn's a really effective representative for his district, right? He actually does real stuff.
It's patronage politics.
Right. And that's the value and the horror of patronage politics all into one, right? But even as Clyburn had all that stroke with the black electorate, as I recall it, and maybe I'm wrong, more than 50% of Democratic voters in South Carolina endorsed the policies that Bernie Sanders, not Joe Biden, embraced, right? And so even though James Clyburn says, as far as I'm concerned, well, I won't do my Clyburn impression because I can't. I don't have one. I was born in North Carolina, not South Carolina, so that's off the table for me. But anyway, even though Clyburn said, as far as he was concerned, that this race was between Biden and Medicare for all, right, or Medicare for all versus Biden, most voters in South Carolina, and it's going to be disproportionately Black voters in the Democratic primary, supported Medicare for all, right, and a living wage. So there's grist for the mill there to work with the masses. But I think in a way we kind of hobble ourselves. Maybe I'm wrong. Cedric's a political scientist. He can beat me back on this one. But maybe we hobble ourselves by insisting that we frame this in terms of Black politics. Because what that does...
I didn't say we need Black politics. We need Black people.
But you began with Joanne Reed et al. And I really appreciated Gaynell Harris's reaction to the Joanne Reed point, which is that Gaynell only knows Joanne because we keep talking about it. But anyway, so that's a good reason to know her. But anyway, so we began with the Black chattering class. Well, they do their thing because of the embrace of a notion of a shared Black interest that transcends time, but who cares about time, but transcends class, right? And this is, kind of where my jump off point was with the problem with all of this stuff that we ignore. And I think Cedric had obviously hammered away at this from the start. We deny Black people complexity in the discourse that we operate with reflexively. It's kind of culturalist discourse that presumes that what Black is something other than an ascriptive category. We presume that we all share the same interest when, how could that be? How could 42 million people all share the same interests, right? It doesn't make...
I think you missed my point, my friend.
No, I
we need
my point. But
we don't need Black politics. Because
Sure.
Black politics is a class politics.
So what do we need?
We need physical Black people of a certain number. I don't mean 42 million Black people.
But one of the things that we need to do, and you got a couple academics here, so that's why I'm going to hammer away at this, is to drive home to many Black people. If you want a Black left, you got to drive home to them that this discourse that we operate with doesn't really benefit most Black people, right? That the discourse of Black politics, as you said, Pascal, is a class politics, but it's a class politics that most Black people don't actually benefit from, right? And most Black people, what we get is symbolic wins. Right? Obama's victory was a victory for Black people named Barack Obama. And I'm confident in that. I didn't presume that I was going to get anything out of it. And I'm still waiting for, my Obama check, my Obama prize, just like I'm still waiting for my OJ prize, as comedian Chris Rock said in the mid 1990s. But again, this discourse that presumes that we all share a common interest actually does the devil's work on this ground. And it makes it harder, I think, to mobilize Black people around these issues, particularly in the context of the hegemony of neoliberalism, right? I think one of your questions, Pascal, and we didn't get to this one, I think it might have been the original first question, had to do with Trump's success with Black voters.
You want to tackle that question? You down to tackle that?
That was a good question.
I was surprised you didn't lead with it, but before you take it away, I just saw on my phone that Shabba-Doo died.
Yes, Shabba-Doo from Soul Train.
Hold up. I got a whole list. I made a whole list because I was going to do a video. And I was going down this list, and I got on the phone with Pascal. This motherfucker tell you, I was like, "Say, bruh, Shabba-Doo died."
I'm heartbroken.
Fuck me up. I just watched. You don't understand. I just watched Breaking the other day.
Well, you live out there. Well, actually, Breaking was set in LA, right?
It's LA, but no, I just watched because I had to watch Ninja 3: The Domination. That stars Lucinda Dickey, aka Kelly, and you gotta chase it with Breaking so you can see Ice-T dressed like Slayer rapping in a hip hop club with a fucked off perm.
I remember that.
Ice-T perm looked like Cedric Beard.
Well, didn't Ice Cube have on didn't he have like studded bracelets or something on?
Yeah, he
he was in a whole get up.
He had a whole wop. That was him. That's him and Body Count, actually. If you watch real close to some of the dudes from
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, it warped my sense of what black life in Los Angeles was in the 1983, 84, whenever that came out.
You thought brothers
About the world.
Yeah. Everybody had Jerry curl or perm and walked around doing
what I'm talking about.
music.
Wait a minute. Imagine that fool's face walking into South Central and the fools was dancing on people's cars and shit. He's like, well, where's Turbo and Ozone at?
Right. Well, I'm getting Charlie Murphy's stories flashback from Chappelle's show when he went to the club. And it's the Prince one specifically.
Yeah, when he saw Mickey Free from
yes.
Mm-hmm. And the new chick is Shallow.
Y'all want to take this question for real quick? One question. It's an important question.
Trump and black voters.
How in 2020 did Donald Trump increase his voter turnout with black voters? Does it say more about the Democratic Party than it does Trump? Does the fact that this phenomenon was more true about black millennials illustrate that new generations of black folk don't see supporting the Democratic Party as paying political dividends? Can we investigate the complicated relationship different segments of Black America have with the Democratic Party? That's a great question. I did some great questions.
That was a good question. Do you think, and I'll ask, do you think that now there's a lot more? I find I'm seeing a lot of black people that are realizing the fact that like the people, especially like Joe Biden running for president, this guy that now they know is the author of 94 crime bill. I feel like a lot of people only see electoral politics in the two-party, right? So that's all there is. Mm-hmm. That's why Candace Owens has that's one of the reasons why she has such a good following, right? Let's leave the plantation.
Right. I mean, the Democratic Party did a very good job based on its actual record of causing black people to think that the Republican Party offers a better option of nothing. It's not that they offer a better option of nothing. It's that the nothing that the Democrats have been giving you started with the Republicans, but you're too young to realize that. You know what I'm saying? They don't know that Nixon started mass incarceration in the post-civil rights era, that Reagan had mass incarceration legislation, that neoliberalism was a Milton Friedman experiment that started in the Nixon era. So because we've come to the limitation of the viability of the Democratic Party in the neoliberal era, because they embraced neoliberalism that kind of starts a little bit with Carter, but is taking a full throttle with Reagan, that, the Democrats is evil, man. It's the liberals. Listen, folks who listen to 50 retakes of Malcolm X speeches about the fox and the wolf, talking about how evil the liberals are. Yeah, the liberals are evil because at the end of the day, they go and work with the foxes to screw you over even more. Guess who that's supposed to be? The wolf, or the wolf, I guess, the Republicans. So neoliberalism is a bipartisan consensus, of trickle up economics that guts your government services and renders it over to private corporations. There's no winners either way. Yes, the neoliberal Democrats are horrible. Democrats are horrible. Republicans are also horrible. We need to imagine a new politics. Stop saying, I don't want to be one of those fools getting suckered into voting Democrats. I'm going to vote for Trump. Or I'm going to vote for, Tom Cotton.
Don't you love the way all of our impersonations of black people make everybody sound like a character on Good Times?
But this is a reality because there is no black left. Who's going to give folk the political education to let them know? Why do you want to deal with these reactionary guys, man? The only difference between them and Democrats is the Republicans would want you to be on the field picking the cotton, and the Democrats probably want you in a big house serving lemonade. That's only the difference.
So either way, you're
all racist.
My whole thing, I hate when it's. I just really hate that whole like, fuck this, and then I'm gonna leave the plantation. Like I have friends, good dudes that want to leave the plantation of the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and I'm like, there's like a million different parties. Like you don't, if you want to leave a plantation, like why would you go to the other plantation?
Well, and Pascal, your point, or at least one of your points, is that by the way, I was laughing at one of Gaynell Harris's remarks about me. But anyway, which was, and I had an experience, interestingly enough, in DC when Obama was president, that I happened to be wearing a suit, and there were. But anyway, I don't need to get into the details of that. But unfortunately, I didn't have Secret Service with me, and that was.
You gotta give us your Obama impression now.
Was it a tan suit?
It's too much pressure for me to do my Obama impression. Folks, I always do tilt the ear because that's a major part of it. I think for my students, and my wife enjoys it too. But anyway, part of your point, Pascal, is that I think the dearth of spaces for left politics, and that would include the dearth of, let's say, spaces for in social media or podcasts and podcast universe for Black left politics, seeds ground to Black people who are dissatisfied with Democrats and imagine that the only alternative they have, in some instances anyway, would be the Republicans, right? I mean, that's one of the points that you're getting at, I think, isn't it? And so it's good that you guys provide this platform, of course. But I think, and Cedric can speak to this with much greater authority, in keeping with your point about the hegemony of neoliberalism, I would say that what hegemony refers to is the ruling class's domination, not just of the political process, but of course, the vehicles that disseminate culture, right? The ruling class
ideological infrastructure,
capacity to change the common sense, like the zeitgeist of a people. And, and we've talked about this for a couple of years now. To a degree, I mean, and this is going to sound kind of Obama-like, except with an important caveat. To a degree, I mean, it's not surprising that Trump would have gained a little ground with Black folk. And I'm not impressed with how much ground he gained, but he clearly gained some ground. Insofar as we've been celebrating as a nation, business people, right, as the nation's smartest people, as the natural leadership class of this country. And on some level, the rap game, hip hop, has likewise championed this notion of entrepreneurialism as being essential to both individual growth and success, but also Black folks' success as a collective, right? And that's an old school line, right? People act like this shit is new, but all this entrepreneurial uplift stuff actually, it just seems to me to be an atavistic throwback to unsuccessful pre-New Deal Black politics on some level, right? And I'm going to stress unsuccessful pre-New Deal Black politics, right? But anyway, so if Americans on the whole embrace the idea that entrepreneurialism is the vehicle for success, and it's crap, right? I mean, it's just silly, but is evidence of a certain kind of the hegemony of Reaganism, then it doesn't surprise me that a stratum of Black people would embrace Trumpism as, something that would be beneficial to Black people. I mean, I think that's one facet of what's going on. And again, I'm going to say one more time that hip hop, I don't know, from the 90s forward, has pretty much struck me as soft pedaling Reaganism, right? The themes that pervade the lyrics in popular hip hop, at least. I'm sure there's stuff that basically nobody listens to that's revolutionary, but the stuff that everybody listens to that's popular, I think is anti-revolutionary because it's Reaganism with a good beat and some dancing attached to it. So that's part of it. And oh, is that what he said? Well, I have a slightly less clean version of hip hop that I'm not going to verbalize now on this platform. But again, I think that's a chunk of it. And there are lots of Black people who are xenophobic. I think we've known Black people who are xenophobic. And in some instances, I mean, there are Black people who might verbalize their own concerns about decline in xenophobic terms, because that's the language that there is available to them. But they have real legitimate concerns about, just like their white counterparts, about the erosion of their livelihoods, right? And their ability to make ends meet and to pass on wealth, if you will, to their progeny. And if you worked at the Chrysler plant in St. Louis, let's say, as a lot of Black people did, when that job went away, it makes sense that if you were Black, just like if you were white, you might have a problem with globalism.
Right.
And Trumpism might be appealing now.
I mean, he definitely has all the right rhetoric, right? And we I think understate the fact that he was in people's homes, not just with this TV show for like 15 years, but he's been a brand.
Right.
To your point about hip hop, I think he's mentioned over 1,000 times in rap songs in the 90s to the early 2000s alone.
Which, from a certain vantage point, I would say if you're a Gen Xer and a Gen X Black person, especially if you're from the tri-state area, as I am, as is Pascal, it's outrageous, because my introduction to Donald Trump actually came in the form of his response to the Central Park Five, and that full page ad he took in the New York Times, wherever, calling for bringing back the death penalty in the state of New York, right? So this is when I learned who Donald Trump was. I think I was.
That he's never backed down on.
No,
after the documentary came out,
the DNA evidence made clear, or I'm sorry, because the DNA evidence made that clear in 1989 or 90, even after the actual sociopath, right, who confessed to it, Donald Trump still refused to back down off of that, right?
Still to this day, like he's been asked since the documentary came out, does he want to go back on what he said? He said, no, I still think those kids did it, and I have friends in the police department that feel the same way.
And so if you have that kind of memory of who Donald Trump is, it's appalling that Donald Trump has this icon status in hip hop. But I think it says a lot about the politics, and I'm definitely using scare quotes, that inform hip hop. Because so much of it is, again, I would say anti-revolutionary, certainly anti-left, as any kind of entrepreneurial, politics would be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll echo some of the things that Touré said. I think, what is some of that mainstream or pop hip hop, except Reaganism with Percocets and Xannies thrown in, here and there, right? Some lean. That's the only distinguishing factor, right? So I think there's the heavy endorsements from, essentially Kanye, 50 Cent, Lil Wayne, all these other people who came forward in this last year. But I mean, I'll back up and say something else. I think a lot of us on the left, not the people necessarily in this conversation, have a hard time thinking about why Trump is so popular and why he came so close this time to, he could have been reelected, right? I think some people thought it was an impossibility, but he had a lot of things going for him, right? One was the logic of incumbency, right? We've seen over the last, just over our lifetimes, the folks on this panel, two-term presidents for the most part, right? There's some exceptions, in the 70s and
Bush one.
And George Bush, the first George Bush, but for the most part, I mean, even somebody as crummy as George W. gets reelected, right? So people tend to support the person they know, especially in the midst of a national crisis. I think that, for those of us who spend a lot of time dwelling in this space and studying the Trump administration and its limitations, it looks one way. But I think for a lot of Americans, right, they're looking at the fact that they got some relief. They didn't get that under Obama, right? They got a check in the mail. I think that mattered to some people. But I think the big issue, we shouldn't be surprised that some segments of blacks would gravitate towards a Trump administration because of that proto-entrepreneurial dimension that Touré laid out. Ken Warren is another person who I've heard make that argument before as well, that there are many people who want to be Trumps, right? They really envision that that's a possibility for them.
Yep.
To actually have that kind of wealth and that sort of power where they can just tell people whatever the hell they want to, and they can boss people around, right? I mean, many people long for that kind of power, even though we might see it as corrupt and, laden with all sorts of troubles. For some folks who are working in shit jobs, they dream of that kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Trump becomes an important avatar for another kind of world that they want beyond whatever the limited environment they may be living in at this particular moment. So I think that's one part of it. Another thing is the optics of the George Floyd murder, police murder, and how people organized around that over the last year. I think for many blacks, folks are captivated. Many black people are already organizing around policing. But we need to be clear that everybody didn't necessarily support Black Lives Matter. And when you look at public opinion polling, support for policing has strengthened over the last few years across the board and across ethnic and racial demographics. And there's certainly some black people who didn't agree with the riots that they saw in cities across the country, during the summertime, and who thought that more policing and more effective policing was necessary. I don't agree with them. I don't think that's necessarily the solution, but you can see how some may have at least, found some sort of they saw some appeal in the law and order rhetoric that was launched by Trump, over the summer and into the fall. So I think we got to be clear about that, right? I think, it's easy for us to slip into a sense of disbelief, but if we take seriously the premise that's animated a lot of the comments here, that Black people are a huge and complex and diverse population with all sorts of different interests, different classes, then we have to be clear that some people are going to embrace, a Republican politics, right? And that is going to grow more popular in the face of somebody who many Americans see as very much an authentic alternative to the kind of triangulation and dissemblance that we see from the Democrats and other Beltway types. And so I think,
he was a Washington outsider
in some ways.
Right. He's a Washington out. To your point, Cedric, he's a Washington outsider.
Right.
And
Janice made the point that many Americans love the rogue, and I think that's true. Particularly if just hammering away at the hip hop point. I mean, that's part of the appeal of the romantic appeal of the drug dealer, if you will, right? I mean, it's someone who is an entrepreneur who is not bound by the law. Well, that sounds a lot to me like Boeing, to be honest, right? I mean, Boeing got to regulate itself. Mm-hmm. It wasn't bound by. That's the logic of deregulation, is what I'm getting at, right?
Right.
I watched RoboCop the other night, like the beginning of it. So you guys got me by a few years, but you guys all were teenagers when you saw RoboCop, right?
Yeah. And you know what? The black police sergeant in RoboCop, Robert Doakey Sr., he's the father of a friend of mine.
Oh, no shit?
Yeah, I met him at my buddy's wedding in New Orleans.
Did he have that mustache?
Yeah, he looked exactly the same in person.
I was watching RoboCop, and I totally kind of I remembered vaguely the premise, but I forgot. It's kind of like, if you want to know what neoliberalism is, if you want to have a real good crash course on neoliberalism and capitalism, put RoboCop in. It starts off I wouldn't even say the corporation, because you can't really call them evil because they also create the hero, right? RoboCop. They're like, well, the police aren't gonna strike because we deal with the unions a certain way, and when we get in and we just need an officer that doesn't sleep. around the clock 24-hour officers. So that's when they bring in the robot guy. But their whole plan is to clean up the city with their robotic police force, get these poor people out, and then bring in new people from outside for these 2 million jobs they have planned to build up, quote unquote, new Detroit. And I put a clip aside and I want, sorry, my son. Can you say goodnight over here? Come here. All the way. They can see you. You can't hide. My son wants to say goodnight. Look, you're like just like you. Say goodnight, Phoenix. Yeah. Oh, okay.
You're always messing with the equipment. Put them down now.
You get from hugs to butt whoopings, just like that. That's how it goes. He's looking at y'all. He didn't want to know who the hell these people is talking to his daddy. I had this clip queued up because you know how I like to play these clips from movies that we have watched and we critique. I also wanted to play some clips from Menace to Society, but I don't think we have the time for you guys to talk that much shit. But the hunt is on. I just want to get your guys kind of take on this real quick.
Yeah? Oh, Bob here gets the assignment. Yeah? Nobody in Security Concepts takes it seriously.
It's a better plan. Fucking Jones. I'd go straight to the old man if I could.
Don't mess with Jones, man. He'll make sushi out of it.
Yeah, you better be careful, man. I hear Jones is a real shark. Who asked you, twerp?
Bob. What about this police thing? What's the problem?
Their union's been bitching ever since we took over. You know, the usual nonsense. We'll turn things around.
Mm-hmm. Good, very good. Let's get started. Our friends, I've had this dream for more than a decade now. A dream which I've invited you all to share with me. In 6 months, we begin construction of Delta City, where old Detroit now stands. Old Detroit has a cancer. The cancer is crime. And it must be cut out before we employ the 2 million workers that will breathe life into this city again.
Yes.
All those shifts in the tax structure have created an economy ideal for corporate growth. Community services, in this case law enforcement, have suffered. I think it's time we gave something back.
Take a close look at the track record of this company, and you'll see that we have gambled in markets traditionally regarded as non-profit. Hospitals, prisons, space exploration. I say good business is where you find it. As you know, we've entered into a contract with the city to run local law enforcement. But at Security Concepts, we believe an efficient police force is only part of the solution. No, we need something more. We need a 24-hour-a-day police officer. A cop who doesn't need to eat or sleep. A cop with superior firepower and the reflexes to use it. Fellow executives.
We also need to not pay any union benefits.
Future of law enforcement. Ed 209.
So if you guys are squeamish, you might want to turn away because this might be one of
play this part.
Don't play it. Is it too violent?
enforcement droid,
Janice
Series
is a nut.
209, is a self-sufficient law enforcement robot. 209 is currently programmed for urban pacification.
What's really
but that
shocking
only
is
the
that
beginning.
this dude went
After a
all the
successful
way
tour of duty
to
in old
Detroit from Beverly Hills.
we can expect 209 to become the
by
hot military product
Bridget
for the
Nielsen.
next decade.
But then he went to Mars shortly thereafter.
Dr. McNamara. We'll lead an
Oh
arrest.
damn, yeah, he did. He went to Mars
Yes, sir.
too.
Could
So
you come up and give us a hand, please?
he
Yes,
was
sir.
busy in the
Played
80s.
the same
Mr. Kinney
guy.
is going to help us
Detective
simulate
Volkmill had
the
the same
typical
suit
arrest and disarming procedure.
and hairstyle
Mr. Kinney,
in so many different eras.
use your gun in a threatening manner. Pointed at Ed 209.
Yes, sir.
Look at that black dude. Another black dude with a horrible hairline.
Please put down your weapon. You have 20 seconds to comply.
I think you'd better do what he says, Mr. Kinney.
You now have 15 seconds to comply. You are in direct
Look at this dude.
penal code
What? Sitting over there with a modular synth. I don't even know what the hell that is.
5 seconds to comply. 4, 3, 2, 1. I am now authorized to use physical force.
Maybe, okay. I will stop it there because that movie almost got, if you guys remember, it originally got an X rating because of the violence in that movie. It's a very, very violent film. And that guy gets shot.
Janice Graham said something very eerie. She said one of the dancing robots at Boston Dynamics is named 209.
On
Not
purpose.
kidding.
Yeah, it's on purpose from that movie. Like that shit, to me, that shit.
Well, this is happening in real time. Like neoliberalism, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism is merging to make these things happen before our eyes. Is that, we got to deal with the labor issues with the cops? We don't need cops. We got robots. Go on. That is a very good, that scene for that movie and that storyline is a very good demonstration of what neoliberalism means, which is gutting public goods service from the government, privatizing them with private corporations while you still pay taxes and have no fiduciary responsibility or connection to the companies or providing you service, which means they can cut the quality of service, they can outsource it, or they can just raise their fees.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, I feel like that's been one of the through lines for the main conversation, especially when we bring up public works projects and the New Deal. That takes place in Detroit. I don't know if y'all been to Detroit recently, but
people still go there.
Eminem does, apparently.
Eminem, I've heard of how bad it got. It's a tragedy.
You at one point in time, and I remember this from working in real estate, you could buy a house there and get one free. I'm being totally serious.
He got McDonald's sales on houses in
you get combo meals on houses. And what's insane about that, if you think about it, the guy's like, oh, we need to clean the city out so we can bring 2 million jobs in.
Right.
2 million jobs so we can
not for you folk.
Yeah,
for
not
other kind of different folk.
And it's real. I feel like for cats that get all mad, and when Cedric was talking about oversimplifying politics, that is another reason why the Donald Trumps of the world are so effective. He oversimplifies everything.
Also, an example of why not challenging capitalism gets you politics that just simply talking about things in terms of racism will not resolve.
Mm-hmm.
Because when they tell you that we're going to integrate 50% of our leadership to African Americans in controlling block margins and et cetera, business grants to participate in this wonderful, you get sucked into we're going to have black businesses. Look at the new black McDonald's. Oh, this is going to be wonderful.
And watch that movie in this futuristic dystopia, The Black Police Sergeant, which was kind of a theme in the 80s. And there's several people of color and women in this C-suite board of directors meeting.
Yep.
So race isn't a problem.
That is hearkening to the future.
But the one positive thing about that scene, at least this is what I thought when I saw it, was that I just presumed that the brother was going to be the one who got capped. That's true. Also a theme in films, horror, sci-fi, you name it, into the 80s, and it was such a cliche that I think the second Scream film had mocked it. Pinkett.
They died first. Yeah.
One of the reasons that both Alien and The Thing are two of my favorite movies, certainly two of my favorite horror movies of all time, isn't just that they were great films, but those were the first two horror films that I saw where the black character made it to either the very end, in the case of Keith David, or almost to the end in the case of Yaphet Kotto, rather than being bumped off first.
Mm-hmm. Also, RoboCop actually has a pretty horribly racist scene where the black villain is peeing, and the guy that becomes RoboCop's partner is incapacitated because she stares at his penis.
And then now the portrayal of the black villain in RoboCop,
which schooled him too,
was really racist. Really extra racist. I watched the film pretty recently, so I was horrified.
Hey, listen, man, we getting long on time, man. So we still got to make this podcast short enough in time that people want to see. Because sometimes they look at that timestamp, they're like, "What? To pass on that one?"
We are 2+ hours in. So do you want to go ahead and call it?
Let's call it, man.
I hope you guys had a good time.
I hope you brothers enjoyed this conversation, man. I think we talked about several important points. We did kind of get back to the script of the questions. I'm not surprised that we deviated from the questions. I think I did warn you guys in the text that in the last show at Dr. Bear, we asked one question and we riffed the whole time. So we started riffing here and we went to at least 2 questions, maybe 3, from the several ones that we put together. So I would like to see you chaps here together to talk about other things about black politics and interrogating the whole mechanism of black politics. And I think it's important for your voices to be heard. Not necessarily everyone has to agree with them, but I think that the deep analysis can be made without believing that you guys are trying to sacrifice the integrity of opinion of certain segments and members of the black community, which is what you're going to get accused of, which I'm sure you have with, quote unquote, oh, they're class reduction ass, which I get from, a lot of folks of a certain generation, et cetera, et cetera. It's amazing the people who put out these charges. You find cats who grew up in the United Colors of Benetton generation who got the most, I hate the Urugu politics I've ever seen in my life. I was like, do you have 2 white friends? Do you know 2 white people? Talking about, with all of this contempt you have for the Urugu. Man, go sit down with that nonsense, man.
My mom wants to know if you guys have seen Soul on Disney Plus.
I
haven't watched it yet. I've heard it's very good.
My friends in anime
recommended that I watch it after he talked me into getting Disney Plus.
Your dad recommended it to us?
No, Jason recommended that I watch it after he talked me into getting it.
Touré, there's going to be something about it you're going to find problematic, so I'm sure it's...
Well, isn't it like computer animated animation?
Yes.
Like Jamie Foxx is like doing a voice.
Jamie Foxx. I didn't realize that was Jamie Foxx.
Talented Jamie Foxx.
Yeah, Jamie Foxx, and isn't Tina Fey the
I saw someone.
She's literally called an annoying white woman's voice.
I saw someone cynically put out, how come all the black people would become ghosts or kind of like semi-mystical figures while the white people get to stay alive in their bodies?
No, everybody. That wasn't true. Everybody became a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
Is that untrue?
It's untrue. If you're a musician, my mom is watching this and she's definitely thrown those shots at me that dude's mom throws at him, played by Felicia Rashad.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure
Oh, so this is kind of like a special place for the musician.
Oh, brother, I had friends that watched it that are not black that was in tears because it hits you at that core, like when you want to do something, and I won't spoil it by telling you. Basically, he's a musician. He becomes a music teacher to pay the bills, but he can't ever get a good gig.
Right.
So finally, a musician that he admires wants to hire him to be the house musician, but he's just got offered a tenured position as the music teacher at this junior high school that he teaches.
Junior high school.
That's kind of like soul destroying job. Like,
yeah.
So I definitely didn't know what that's like to go, oh, do I want to die every day or do I want to be really, really poor?
Janice Graham is boycotting Disney, so she will pass.
Oh, why?
I don't really like Pixar style animation, so the only thing I've ever seen in that vein is Sausage Party, which was funny.
I hope she's boycotting Disney for the horrible portrayal of Wonder Woman. That would be great.
Is that Disney? It's DC. I know that. No, that's Paramount.
It's DC and Disney. DC was bought by Disney.
No, Marvel was.
Marvel. Oh, really? Oh, okay.
DC is owned by Paramount or one of those other big studios.
Anyway, man.
So, all right, Molly, I didn't see it. Trent Reznor did do the music with John Baptiste.
Oh. Hey, well, it's good to see Janice Graham here and Robert Burt. I've seen your posts many times, so it's cool.
Robert Burt is a philosopher and an academic at Morgan State.
Oh, no shit.
So he is well versed in the canon. Brilliant brother.
Clearly.
Enjoy his post very much. He's big poster in our Blacks Against Capitalism group.
But I do have to say, this would not have happened had Cedric not returned my email. So we are all 6 degrees of Cedric Johnson.
All right.
The irony in that?
Glad to be a part of it.
Facebook friends.
All right, man. Let's do this again, brothers.
Thank you guys very much.
I would wish you Happy New Year, but I'm going to end up texting you tomorrow.
That's true.
I want to talk guitar shit with you anyway.
Right?
I appreciate you guys so much. Cedric, because of meeting and having a conversation with you that people still tell me about to this day, by the way. And when your name comes up in certain circles, everybody's eyes get big as Oreo cookies. And, oh, Cedric Johnson, I love that guy. I want to talk to that guy, Cedric Johnson. So the fact that you made all this happen means a lot to me because now I've become friends with Touré, and I'm definitely lightweight family with Pascal. Love you guys.
Awesome tomorrow.
All right, y'all be good.